그러면
세 번째
제가
질문.
질문을 좀 드려보겠습니다.
요거.
마틴울프 씨, 저 인플레이션이 나타날 거라는 데는 뭐 대체적으로는 스스로도 동의하시는 것 같은데 혹시 나타난다면 언제쯤 그 시점이 되겠습니까? 그게 투자자들의 시기에는 매우 중요한 포인트가 될 텐데요.
Well, the first answer to that is I don't know. And it depends, in any case, very much on policy reactions. There are two elements in the story they're telling. So one I've described, basically relative cost of labor rises again. But there is another element, and then you can see the mechanisms, is the effect on real interest rates and public finances. So where we are now is most countries have a very large amount of public debt. The developed countries as a whole now have as much debt, public debt, relative to GDP as they had after the Second World War. So this is the highest, as high as it's ever been in history in terms of public debt relative to GDP in Europe, in America, and of course in Japan. Now, in addition, their economies, their countries are aging. So the cost of healthcare and of pensions, everything connected with the old is rising. And the people who are working and paying taxes on their work income is becoming a smaller part of the economy. Now, this creates, and finally, because people are becoming old, the proportion of the population that is saving, which tend to be the people in their 40s and 50s and early 60s, they are declining. And the people who are spending more than their income is rising. This is a long-term process. So what this is likely to mean is we move into a world where labor gets more expensive, savings become scarcer, so real interest rates rise, and public spending rises. Okay? Now, this could create a very serious public finance crisis because the governments have to roll over these huge debts. Their maturities are not so long, and the real interest rates will be higher. The growth rates will be low because we're aging and the proportion of the population at work is declining. So even if productivity grows, GDP per head does not grow so fast. I know this is long. I'll just finish. So the government deficits might rise, refinancing debt might become more expensive, and then they have a choice: cut spending, raise taxes, or borrow from the central bank, print money. We don't know what they're going to do, but the argument of the book is they might do the last. Get rid of the debt by inflating it. How long would this process take? Well, I would say they're talking about a process that will work out possibly over 20 years or more. It's not tomorrow, but they are accurately describing the underlying pressures on the public finances, and labor costs, given where we now are as a result of the financial crisis and COVID-19 with these enormous public debts.
마틴은 사실 그 마지막 그 마틴의 설명 중에서 귀담아 들어야 될 대목이 사실 그 앞으로의 그 정부의 부채 문제,
네.
통화량의 문제에 대해서 언급을 했는데 정부는 선택할 수밖에 없죠. 정부 지출을 줄이거나
네.
향후에 코로나 사태가 진정되면 정부 지출을 줄이거나 세금을 올려야 될 겁니다. 그렇지 않다라면은 남아 있는 방법은 돈을 찍어내는 방법이라고 마틴울프는 얘기를 했습니다. 아까 중앙은행이 계속 돈을 찍어낼 수 있다라고, 찍어내서 정부의 재정을 뒷받침해줄 수밖에 해줄 수밖에 없을 수도 있다라고 말씀했는데, 마틴, 그렇다면은 사실 그 현대 화폐 이론 MMT가 주장하는 현상이 현실이 되는 거 아닐까요?
Okay, so this has several elements. The first is the central banks are certainly not committed to further open-ended expansions of the monetary base from where they are now. But some of that is indeed likely. That's clearly right. The central banks deny that this is MMT. They deny it, and I've written a column about this, because they argue it's reversible. And if necessary, it will be reversed. Therefore, it is not permanent monetary financing. And MMT is essentially permanent monetary financing. That is at least the logic of MMT, is that the monetary financing would be permanent so long as the economy has any slack. And in addition, MMT thinks that the best instrument for regulating the economy is fiscal policy, not monetary policy. So in the MMT world, money finances government, and government regulates the economy through fiscal policy. And the central banks of today would say that's not what they're doing. They are not financing the government permanently, and they continue to regulate the economy. We don't know who is right, because we will only know when we see what happens when the economies recover, whether it is reversed or not. And the honest answer is we really don't know, but I suspect it's sort of going to be a bit of both. Some of the monetary financing will be permanent and some will not. There is one other aspect of this which is crucial. In the MMT world, the central bank is passive. It simply finances the government because the government chooses not to borrow through bonds. In our world, the central bank is not passive. It decides monetary policy because it's independent. That's not the MMT world. But of course, governments could change that. They could withdraw central bank independence. They could do that overnight in many places. And then, of course, we would be in an MMT world. So the truth is, at the moment, we don't know whether we're in that world or not. And the final point is, would MMT without limit lead to inflation? My view is probably. Because there is a limit to how much money the public will be willing to hold, particularly if they begin to become worried about inflation at all. They will try to dispose of money, and that would create quite certainly inflationary consequences.
일본에서도 비슷한 MMT는 아닙니다만 결국은 중앙은행의 발권력을 통해서 시중에 자금을 공급하는 양적 완화가 나타나서 사실은 처음에 그걸 사용할 때도 저러다가 강한 인플레가 나타나면 어떡하느냐라는 걱정을 했습니다만 일본에서는 그런 일이 나타나지 않았습니다. 그래서 이제 MMT 역시 가능한 게 아니냐라는 게 MMT를 찬성하는 분들의 주장인 듯한데 인플레이션이 나타나는 나라와 그렇지 않은 나라 인플레이션이 나타난다면 어떤 요인 때문에 나타날 것인지에 대한 명확한 구분이 좀 있을까요?
I think the standard argument why QE, and I've just focused on QE, quantitative easing, has not created inflation, is that also applies to the Western countries after the global financial crisis. And I wrote about it in my book on the financial crisis, which was called The Shifts and the Shocks. So the argument is this. This is what Milton Friedman said. This is not new. The relevant money supply is not the money created by the central bank, but the money in the hands of the public. It's quite difficult to define what that is. Money is a concept, is a complex idea in a modern society. Our money is different from the money of old, which was coins, right? But we are talking here about deposits in the banking system, particularly non-interest bearing deposits. So what is called M2 or M3 in standard monetary statistics. M3 consists then overwhelmingly of the liabilities of banks. The liabilities of banks are matched to a small degree by the assets of banks in the form of reserves at the central bank. But they are also determined by bank loans. Indeed, the principal assets against which broad money exists, it created the assets against the liabilities are bank loans. Now imagine a situation, which is the actual situation, in which the banks don't lend much because there's no demand for loans in the economy, because the economy is just not growing very much and nobody wants to borrow. Perhaps because they've had a debt shock. So there's very little borrowing. The central bank enormously increases reserves. That increases the money supply a bit, but the central bank's reserves are quite small, even now, in the context of the total money supply. So if the banks don't lend, the central bank's expansion of the money, its money, central bank money, doesn't have a huge effect. It has an effect, but not a huge effect on the money held by the public. And the result is the money supply is not really growing very much. And that was very relevant in Japan, has been, and because the banks basically haven't lent very much for a long, long time. And nobody wants to borrow. And the same applied in the West after the financial crisis. Even now with this crisis, it's a bit different because banks have been lending. So broader money has been growing. So I think we will have a test of this hypothesis over the next few years if broad money continues to explode upwards as it has done this year in, for instance, the US. But there is no great difficulty from a monetarist point of view. I'm just presenting the monetarist argument in understanding why you can expand central bank money and not affect the money held by the public, and therefore not affect what the public does with its money. It doesn't spend it because it doesn't have much more of it. It holds it instead. And again, finally, as long as inflation remains low, There's no reason to change this behavior, but it could become unstable in the following way. Let us suppose inflation begins a bit. It doesn't need to be much, but let's suppose inflation in Japan were 3%. Then the money supply, which pays no interest, is reducing in value in real terms 3% every year. Then people might say, well, it's better to spend the money now. Buy foreign currency. Buy something else rather than leave it in my bank deposit. Then that's how an inflationary process begins. That's never happened, partly because, as I said, the environment has been low inflation. So this is how I would explain what's happened in Japan. It's an unstable equilibrium. It could last, but it's an unstable equilibrium.
이거는 좀 강 팀장님이 설명을 좀 해주셔야 되겠어요. 제가 듣기로는 돈을 중앙은행이 푼다고 해서 인플레이션이 매번 나타나는 건 아닌데 중앙은행이 돈을 풀고 금리를 낮출 때 사람들이 적극적으로 대출을 받아서 실제적으로 리얼 머니를 만드느냐 그렇지 않느냐에 따라 달려있다. 일본에서는 중앙은행과 정부는 돈을 풀었는데 사람들은 대출을 잘 받지 않았다. 불경기에 따른 어떤 심리적인 위축 때문에. 그 차이가 있는 것이지 다른 나라라고 일본하고 똑같은 일이 벌어질 것 같지는 않다는 설명이었어요. 그런 겁니까?
그럼 물가는 어디서 올라가는가? 이 사람들이 좋아하는 것은 한 나라의 평균 소득에 의해서 결정이 된다. 평균 소득이 늘어나서 그 소득의 씀씀이가 늘어났을 때 진정한 돈의 수요가 늘어나고 그렇게 해야지 물가가 올라간다라고 얘기를 합니다. 단순히 통화량이 늘면은 당연히 물가가 올라간다 이런 그래서 화폐 수량설이라는 하나의 그 공식이 있지 않습니까? 그것을 왼쪽부터 설명하는 게 주류고 그다음 오른쪽부터 해석하는 사람들 여기 한번 넣어준다. MV equal PT라고 했을 때 PT 이쪽에서 해석하고 이쪽에서 해석하는 사람들 나중에 공식 하나 넣어주세요.
서로 다르다 이거죠.
다르죠.
그러니까 뭔가 사람들의 소득이 일단 늘어나고 그 소득을 바탕으로 지출이 일어나는.
그렇죠.
아무것도 없는데 돈 빌려서 호빵 사 먹기는 어렵다.
당연하죠.